Hello! I'm delighted to guide you on a journey through the story of medieval England. This is a tale spanning nearly 1,000 years of ambition, faith, and relentless change. We will witness tribes becoming kingdoms, Viking ships pounding on English shores, Norman knights storming castles, and a slow transformation into something unprecedented. It's not just about battles and dates, though there are many. It's about people like you and me, striving, fighting, and believing in a better future. I imagine Britain around AD 410, when the mighty Roman legions had finally departed. Empty forts and silent roads lay scattered across the land, remnants of a lost world. It was a time of darkness and uncertainty, a great vacuum in the leadership of these islands. But out of that silence, a new story was beginning. A story of peoples on the move and lands being settled, of kings and wars yet to come. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, I will guide you through the sweeping saga of medieval England. We've already started in the dim light of that early age. I close my eyes and picture restless tribes on the distant horizon. Storm clouds gather over the North Sea, and over those gray waves they sail toward Britain. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, even Frisians from across the sea, driven by need and opportunity, all set their sights on the fertile valleys of post-Roman Britain. It was not a single invasion, but a slow tide of migration, a wave of small war bands, each led by its own lord, each dreaming of land to call home. They brought their own gods, their laws, and their language, the seeds of what would become modern English. When these new peoples arrived in Britain, they found a population in flight and disarray. Many Romano-British fled into the hills of Wales and Cornwall, carrying with them the flickering flame of Roman ways and Christian faith. Legends tell us that in those days, a leader named Arthur may have risen to unite the Romano-British against the Saxons. Whether Arthur was a single king of Camelot or a symbolic hero of many, his story reminds us of the clash of cultures underway. In the end, the Saxons established themselves across most of England. Old Roman roads became country paths, and towns like London and York grew under English rule. In villages and homesteads, Roman traditions of law, Latin, and Christianity mixed with the new Anglo-Saxon way of life. This blending of cultures would create the roots of a nation stretching into the future. I close my eyes and imagine the earliest Saxon kingdoms forming from the chaos. These new kingdoms were nothing like the old Roman provinces. They were personal kingdoms, tied by loyalty. I picture myself in a smoky wooden hall. The king stands with his band of warriors around him, rewarding the brave with land and treasure. The scop, the court poet, sings of great deeds and monsters. Those stories are the ancestors of our own legends and language. The old Saxons had strange gods: Tew, a war god; Woden, the wise wanderer; Thor, god of thunder; and Freya, goddess of love and fertility. These gods were not distant. They lived and struggled as men do, and even they knew they could perish when the world ends in fire and ice. By the end of the 6th century, that great wave of migration had built several new kingdoms on this land. In Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Kent, kings now ruled with warriors behind them. Life was still hard. Most folk were farmers or fishermen, worshipping old gods deep in the forests. Yet, a new identity was forming. People began to think of themselves less as Angles or Saxons, and more simply as English. This sense of a single land and people would grow, especially under the influence of the church and future kings. Yet, even amidst war, something remarkable happened. Civilization grew. English kings, once only raiders, became patrons of culture. For example, King Offa of Mercia built an enormous earthwork along the Welsh border, Offa's Dyke, to defend his kingdom around 775 AD. Mercian silver pennies began to spread, showing that England now had its own currency. And in the monasteries, scribes produced texts in Old English, preserving history and law. Life in these early kingdoms was still hard, but the idea of an English nation was taking root. Conversion to Christianity. These Celtic missionaries brought more than religion. They offered a bookish new worldview and a skill for reading and writing. Kings began to hear the Christian message. I picture King Edwin of Northumbria, surrounded by wise men, deciding to be baptized in 627 AD. He established the first cathedral at York and sent off more missionaries to the south. Slowly, kingdom by kingdom, the cross spread over the land. By the late 7th century, England was fully Christian, but debate remained about how to practice it. In 664 AD, the Synod of Whitby gathered bishops and nobles to settle differences between the Celtic Christian traditions of the north and the Roman tradition of the south. King Oswiu of Northumbria chose the Roman way. That decision finally put all of England under one church calendar and hierarchy. Within a few generations, from Kent to Northumbria, every kingdom had its own bishop and cathedral. England's old pagan age had truly ended. Conversion was not simply flipping a switch. It was a negotiation, a blending of old and new beliefs. The missionaries wisely respected local traditions, giving Christian festivals familiar names and connecting them to ancient customs. Over time, Christianity reshaped Anglo-Saxon England. Stone churches replaced wooden shrines, and monasteries became centers of learning and prayer. By the middle of the 8th century, nearly all the ruling classes had embraced the new faith, setting the course for England's future. Monasteries and Learning. As Christianity took root, I see monasteries springing up across England. In quiet rooms, monks copied ancient texts, preserved history, and wrote the Gospels. These religious communities became centers of learning and art. I picture monks hunched over illuminated manuscripts, pages glowing gold in candlelight. Even during hard times, this knowledge was carried on, connecting England to the wider Christian world. The monastic scholars of England did more than preserve the past. They built a reputation for learning that echoed across Europe. One such scholar was the Venerable Bede, a monk at Jarrow. He wrote the first history of England, the ecclesiastical history, in 731 AD. His careful chronicle of kings and saints spread knowledge of England's story far and wide. Another English scholar, Alcuin of York, was invited to Charlemagne's court to teach. He helped launch the Carolingian Renaissance on the continent. These monks and their books made England known as the Island of Saints and Scholars. The Vikings Arrive. In the late 8th century, a new storm rolled in from the north. I picture Viking longships gliding into harbor. In 783 AD, they attacked the holy monastery at Lindisfarne with fire and sword. Monks fled with their lives. Ancient art and relics were stolen or destroyed. This was just the beginning. Raiders from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark became regular threats. They came by sea to burn villages and seize treasures, and then faded back over the waves before local armies could muster. In fact, the Vikings weren't just ruthless raiders. They became part of England's story. Some settled and intermarried with the locals. The powerful Viking warlord Guthrum, defeated by Alfred, actually lived peacefully in East Anglia after accepting baptism. The Vikings introduced customs, words, and even legal ideas. Under the Danelaw, parts of England had special rules influenced by Norse law, including paying a set sum, a vergild, if you killed someone. Over time, the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons began to blend. Norse words like sky, window, and husband entered the English language, gifts from that era of contact. Over time, some Vikings settled and became part of the land they raided. They took territory in eastern England, an area later called the Danelaw, and mixed with the local people. Yet every time it seemed England might break, a leader rose to rally the people. The greatest of those leaders was King Alfred the Great of Wessex. Alfred the Great. It was during this crisis that one man became England's greatest hero, King Alfred of Wessex. Against all odds, Alfred gathered his weary army and in 878 AD met the Vikings at the Battle of Hastings. I imagine the clash of swords on a Somerset field and Alfred emerging victorious. With peace made, he cleverly balanced war with wisdom. He created a network of fortified towns, burhs, so that villagers could shelter safely during raids. He even reformed the legal code, drawing from all English traditions, but infusing it with ideas of mercy and justice. Alfred was not only a warrior, but a scholar king, determined that his people would survive and thrive. King Alfred loved learning. When he wasn't at war, he sat with books and scholars. I picture him translating great works into English, believing that wisdom should belong to all his people. Alfred personally translated works like the Pastoral Care and Gregory's Gospel book into English so his people could understand God's law. He famously said he found no enjoyment sweeter than to sit under an oak tree with a book in his hand. Under Alfred's rule and that of his successors, the whole of England was slowly reunited. By the early 10th century, Alfred's son Edward and grandson Ethelstan would stretch Wessex's influence across the land. At Brunanburh in 937, Ethelstan finally crushed a coalition of Vikings, Scots, and others, proving one king could rule all of England. From these victories grew a new national consciousness, the idea of England itself. Anglo-Saxon Revival. Even though Alfred had driven back the invaders, life in England was still uncertain. We might wonder, what happened to the people already living in Britain? Many fled into the mountains of Wales and Cornwall, carrying with them the flickering flame of Roman ways and Christian faith. Others stayed in towns and villages, blending old customs with those of the newcomers. Legends tell us that in those days, a leader named Arthur may have risen to unite the Romano-British against the Saxon invaders. Whether Arthur was a single king of Camelot or a symbol of many brave warriors, his story reminds us of the deep roots and proud heritage of Britain. In the end, the Saxons became the new masters of England, but they inherited a land rich in both British and Anglo cultures. By the end of the 9th century, life was busy. Villagers tended their fields, monks tended their prayers, and courts gathered in great halls. King Alfred and the kings after him fostered learning. Alfred himself invited scholars like Asser and Grimbald from across the sea to teach at his court. Books in Old English spread. The great scholar Bede's history was already inspiring people. Alfred is often called the defender of the English, for good reason. He defended not only their bodies in war, but their minds and spirits through learning. Even today, people remember Alfred as the one who rescued learning from darkness. New threats from the north. After a century of peace, fresh threats arose. The Danes regained strength under their own kings. By 1000 AD, England was rich but still fractured. In 1013, King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark seized his chance. He sailed in with a great army and defeated the English. The Wessex king at that time, Ethelred the Unready, was forced to flee. In January 1016, Svein died on campaign, but his son Conduit continued the conquest. By October 1016, Cnut the Great was declared king of all England, ruling a vast North Sea empire from Denmark to Norway and England. For about 20 years, Cnut ruled England, not as an alien usurper, but as its legitimate king. He kept many of Alfred's institutions. Sheriffs still collected taxes, the old shire system remained, and English bishops still taught in their cathedrals. Cnut married Ethelred's widow Emma and became, in a sense, an English king by choice, not just by force. Even under foreign kings, many of Alfred's reforms endured. Cnut himself became close to the church and supported his bishops. His son Harold Harefoot and then Harthacnut would continue to rule. But by 1042, the old dynasty returned. Edward the Confessor, Ethelred's son, took the throne. Edward the Confessor and the Succession Crisis. Edward the Confessor's accession in 1042 brought back the old royal line. Edward was a devout, gentle king with Norman ties. He'd spent many years in exile at the Norman court. He built a magnificent stone abbey at Westminster and tied England's church closely to Rome, but he also governed wisely and fairly most of the time. However, he had no children. When Edward died suddenly in January 1066, it opened a deadly succession crisis. Three mighty claimants emerged at Edward's death. One was Harold Godwinson, England's most powerful noble and the king's brother-in-law. Harold was a seasoned warrior and had the support of many English lords and the Witan, the Council of Nobles. Another was William, Duke of Normandy, who insisted that Edward had promised him the crown years before, and that Harold himself had sworn on holy relics to uphold William's claim. Far to the north, King Harald Hardrada of Norway also claimed a right based on ancient agreements with Nut. Now, England stood on the edge of a blade as these contenders prepared for war. The Norman Duke. Across the English Channel, William of Normandy, nicknamed the Bastard from his birth, was preparing to realize his claim. William had grown up facing rebellion and danger, and he had forged Normandy into a strong duchy. He traveled through Europe, learning warcraft and politics. By 1066, he had become a master of military organization. He disciplined his knights and trained an army for years in secrecy. Norman knights carried long lances and wore chainmail in a way the English had rarely seen. William also knew the power of the church. He built strong ties with the Pope, doing for the Normans what Alfred had done for the English. In fact, the Pope sent William a papal banner, declaring Harold Godwinson a usurper. With that holy sanction, William assembled the largest invasion fleet of his time. Nearly 700 ships were gathered. When at last they set sail in September 1066, they carried not only warriors, but horses, weapons, and all supplies needed for war. William's crossing of the Channel was a triumph of planning, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of England. Battle of Stamford Bridge. But first came the hammer from the north. In the summer of 1066, King Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded with a large army, allied with Harold Godwinson's estranged brother, Tostig. I see King Harold rushing north through England's Midlands, gathering forces at incredible speed. They caught Hardrada by surprise at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066. For a moment, victory hung in the balance. The Viking king fought with berserker fury, but English arrows and axes found their mark. King Hardrada was struck down, and the Norwegian army was shattered. The battle's end marked the close of the Viking Age in England. Only 24 of the original 300 longships were needed to carry the Norwegian survivors back home. Yet, this victory was costly. Harold's men were exhausted and scattered in the north, and English warriors had to rush south at once. They had little time to rest when news came that William's fleet had finally landed on the Sussex coast. The two armies would meet again within 3 weeks, and this time it would be a battle to the death. The Battle of Hastings. On October 14, 1066, destiny was decided on Senlac Hill near Hastings. The English army, still weak from their forced march, formed the famous shield wall atop a hill. William's Norman knights and infantry advanced to the valley below. It was a clash of civilizations. The Norman cavalry charged repeatedly up the hill. The English braced their shield wall against the blows. Norman archers loosed a hail of arrows into the sky, their tips glinting in the sun. Many fell short or to the ground, but wave after wave of mounted knights crashed into the shields. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Neither side could easily gain the advantage. Twice, rumors spread that William had been killed, causing panic. But William lifted his helmet to show his men he lived, rallying their spirits once more. In the late afternoon, the tide turned by a clever trick. Some Norman foot soldiers feigned a retreat. Portions of the English line broke ranks to pursue them. Suddenly, the Norman cavalry wheeled around and cut those men down. Seizing the moment, William's forces pressed the attack. King Harold, defending the banner of England, was struck down. Legend says an arrow through the eye, though fierce fighting likely involved many swords. With their king dead, the English line finally broke. That afternoon, an era ended. Anglo-Saxon England fell to the Norman conquerors. William the Conqueror. William did not immediately march into London. Instead, he swept through the south, crushing resistance. Town after town heard what had happened and surrendered without a fight. Fear did William's work for him. On Christmas Day, 1066, William finally entered London. In Westminster Abbey, he was crowned King of England in a grand ceremony. That was William's triumph, the moment he became king. But England was not yet truly his to rule. Outside the Abbey, however, rioters remembered the old regime. The Norman spearman Louis, standing among the crowds, saw Londoners shouting insults at the archbishop conducting the ceremony. William drew his sword to defend his presiding bishop's honor, but others disarmed him, a clear sign that order was still fragile. Meanwhile, the people of England discovered their world had changed forever. King Harold's great earls were dead or in flight, and a new class of Norman nobles took their lands. Towns and countryside were under the watch of castles, Norman knights built at every key spot. William had won the crown at Hastings and Westminster, but he did not yet have the kingdom. Now came the true challenge, turning conquest into lasting rule. The Conquest Consolidated. Over the winter and following years, William proved as good an administrator as he was a warrior. He took lands from rebellious Saxon nobles and gave them to his Norman followers. In 1067 and 1068, there were uprisings in Kent, East Anglia, and the north, but William crushed them one by one. He marched through the north in winter campaigns, driving rebels into submission. Villages burned in flames, crops were destroyed, but resistance was broken. Chroniclers would later write that in some regions, no smoke rose from any hearth for years. At the same time, William established new government. He commissioned the great survey we now call the Domesday Book in 1086, recording every man, his land, and his livestock so that taxes could be collected fairly. He set up the feudal system across England. Every baron held land from the king in exchange for military service, and knights held from barons. This replaced the old Saxon councils with a rigid hierarchy headed by himself. Stone castles were built everywhere, at London, at Warwick, at York, symbols of Norman power and control. King William also restructured the church to secure his rule. He appointed his close friend Lanfranc, a learned Norman monk, as Archbishop of Canterbury. Under William's reign, English bishops were either Normans or recruited Normans. They connected England firmly to the new Gregorian church reforms. By merging Norman and English practices in the coronation service, William started the tradition of a unified ceremony at Westminster that persists to this day. A new order. By the time of William's death in 1087, England was a different land. The old Anglo-Saxon order was gone, replaced with Norman law, language, and lords. But not everything changed overnight. English shires and counties still existed, and peasants continued to farm the same fields. What changed was who held power and how it was exercised. Normans sat in the king's courts, Normans collected taxes, and Norman castle keepers oversaw the countryside. King William's sons, William II and then Henry the Fern, would continue to rule, each leaving their mark. Henry the First, 1100–1135, William's youngest son, further strengthened the monarchy. He created the exchequer for royal finances and was the first king to call his great council a parliament. Henry even made his nobles swear not to confiscate each other's lands without justice. His famous issue, the Coronation Charter of 1100, promised that no free man would be imprisoned unjustly, an early step toward rule of law. Meanwhile, society beneath them was changing too. Towns were growing, markets bustling, and the old Saxon language was gradually mixing with French. This mix of laws and customs was the beginning of England's common law tradition. On the other hand, the William Rufus in the East Cloister or cathedrals, This raucous second son, William Rufus, King William II, drank wine and held festivals under Norman arches, forging England's rough new nobility into a powerful force. Across England, life continued. The Tower of London, begun in William's reign, grew stone by stone as a royal fortress. Norman cathedrals, with their rounded arches and thick walls, replaced wooden churches. In Durham, Gloucester, and Canterbury, churches soared upward with carved reliefs of prophets and saints. Even in small villages, stone began to replace thatch. The Bayeux tapestry, embroidered by Norman hands, would still record the story of the conquest for future generations. The Plantagenets and Becket. Fast forward to 1144. The last Norman king, Stephen, died amid years of civil strife. His successor was Henry Plantagenet, Henry II, a man of great energy and ambition. Henry II ruled over not just England, but also much of France by inheritance and marriage. He sought to make the law fairer and the treasury richer. He organized the assizes and royal courts so that royal justices would roam England to hear cases, an early form of jury trial. Yet, Henry's greatest drama was with the church. He chose his friend Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury, thinking Thomas would be loyal to the crown. But Becket took his spiritual duties to heart and defended the church's rights. The two men quarreled fiercely. In 1170, in a terrible burst of rage, 4 of Henry's knights murdered Archbishop Becket as he was kneeling in Canterbury Cathedral. The blood on the altar made Becket a martyr. King Henry himself was heartbroken. To atone, he did public penance, walking barefoot to the cathedral. Becket's tomb soon became a pilgrimage site. The power of the king in England had been checked by the moral authority of the church, a powerful lesson for all ages. Though Henry regained control of the kingdom, he had seen that even he must yield to a higher law in matters of faith. Magna Carta and growing rights. Henry II's sons each became king in turn, ending the Angevin Empire by the time of Henry III. But skip ahead to 1215. King John, Henry's youngest son, was very different, a scoundrel and incapable leader. He lost most of his French lands and taxed his people heavily. In frustration, a group of rebel barons took arms. In June 1215, they cornered King John at Runnymede, on the Thames. There, he was forced to put his seal to the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. This document declared that even the king was subject to law. It promised the barons and all free men that there would be no taxation without representation, at least not arbitrary taxation, and established the right to due process. John tried to ignore the charter, plunging England into civil war almost immediately. But the idea of Magna Carta lived on. It introduced principles like rule of law and rights of subjects that would echo through the centuries. The Great Charter was reissued and expanded by later kings. It became a foundation stone for the development of English liberty. Even our modern ideas of government trace back to those lines written by royal command nearly a millennium ago. Montfort and early parliaments. The struggle between king and nobles continued. In 1265, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, a man of French origin who had sided with the barons, took the bold step of summoning a parliament that included not only nobles and churchmen, but also elected knights and burgesses from towns. It was the first time commoners sat at the king's council. Montfort's revolution was short-lived. He was defeated and killed the same year, but his idea was not. The next king, Edward the Moors, son of Henry III, embraced the concept when it suited him. In 1285, Edward summoned what became known as the Model Parliament, both lords and commoners from each shire and town. In this way, the structure of English Parliament was born. It would evolve over time into our modern House of Commons and House of Lords. In practical terms, Edward the Fawn needed these assemblies to raise taxes for his wars in Wales and Scotland. Meanwhile, Edward himself was busy conquering. By 1290, he had subdued Wales, making its Prince Llywelyn a vassal, and even pressed his claim in Scotland. The Model Parliament of 1295 showed he was careful to bind all estates of the realm, nobles, clergy, and townsfolk, to his decisions, especially on money. This blend of fierce warfare and shrewd politics marked the late 13th century. War and Plague. In 1307, Edward III died, and his son became King Edward II. But Edward II was weak and vain. He squandered money, and his favoritism led to turmoil. By 1320, barons were again in arms. Meanwhile, in 1337, Edward I's grandson, also called Edward, revived his claim to the French throne. This started the 100 Years' War. King Edward III of England first won fame at sea and in France. In 1346, he defeated much larger French armies at Crécy using new tactics, English longbowmen pouring death from a distance. That victory gave the young Edward's reign prestige. His son, Edward the Black Prince, would later win at Poitiers in 1356 and capture the French king. England seemed on top of the world. But in 1348 came calamity. The Black Death struck England. Ships from abroad brought a plague that spread like wildfire. Within 2 years, half the people in towns and countryside had died. I see English streets emptied, fields untended, and villages abandoned. The church was full of funerals, and monks scribbled prayers for the dying. This plague was a catastrophe that dwarfed any military defeat or royal crisis. Society was shaken. With so few workers, peasants, and artisans found they could demand higher wages and better treatment. The old order was breaking down. Even kings had to grapple with shortages and unrest. Edward III lived to see England's fortunes turn on and off. He died in 1377, an old king who had seen both victory abroad and tragedy at home. Richard II and Changing Times. When Edward III died, his 10-year-old grandson became Richard II. Early in Richard's reign, taxes to fund wars provoked the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Thousands of commoners, led by Wat Tyler and others, marched on London demanding reform. A 14-year-old Richard stood at Smithfield, meeting the rebels face to face, and surprisingly gave them pledges of freedom. But after they dispersed, he reneged. The revolt leaders were hunted down and executed. This uprising showed how strong the new class of townspeople and laborers had become after the plague. Richard II grew into a cultured but autocratic king. He built himself a grand new tower at the Tower of London and lavishly furnished his court. He believed in the divine right of kings, which put him at odds with many nobles. He quarreled with his powerful uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, and even with Henry Bolingbroke, his cousin, son of the Duke of Lancaster. By 1399, an unhappy mix of political exile and rebellion brought Bolingbroke back to England. He raised an army, captured Richard, and forced him to abdicate. The first deposing of an anointed king in English history sent shockwaves. Parliament approved Henry Bolingbroke as King Henry IV, but only on the condition that the nobility's consent mattered. Richard was taken to Pontefract Castle, where he disappeared, a grim reminder that a king could fall from grace and vanish into the shadows of history. From Lancaster to Tudor. Henry IV, 1399–1413, was no saint, but he was shrewd. He quelled rebellions. In 1405, Archbishop Scrope in Wales with Owain Glyndwr, and kept the throne in Lancaster hands. His son, Henry V, 1413–1422, was the young warrior king of legend. In 1415, he stormed back into France and won the great victory at Agincourt, where the odds were against him. French knights charging foolishly fell to English longbows in a narrow field. Henry married the French princess Catherine, but at only 35 he died of illness in 1422, leaving an infant heir, Henry VI. King Henry VI's reign, 1422–1461, was full of turbulence. He continued the wars in France but lost most of Edward III's gains. By 1453, English armies had been driven out of all French territory except the port of Calais. Henry's own health wavered. Periods of madness in the 1450s meant he governed very little. England was really run by nobles and by Henry's queen, Margaret of Anjou, who was determined to protect her baby son. Those tensions exploded into the Wars of the Roses, a dynasty struggle between Lancaster, Red Rose, and York, White Rose. In 1455, the first battle took place at St. Albans. For decades, English nobles fought pitched battles almost yearly. Towton, the bloodiest of all, Wakefield, Tewkesbury, and more. Edward, the young Duke of York's son, eventually seized the throne in 1461 as King Edward IV. Henry VI was deposed, but the wars wavered back and forth, with Henry briefly restored in 1470 before Edward reclaimed the crown in 1471. The conflict devastated the nobility. By the end, fewer great houses remained, and the population had suffered deeply from war and disease. Edward IV reigned until 1483. His brother, Richard III, took over but ruled poorly. Richard's claim was contested because Edward IV's sons were made illegitimate. In 1485, as Richard marched north to meet rebellion, a new rival appeared, Henry Tudor of Lancaster, a descendant of an illegitimate branch of the Lancastrians. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry's forces killed Richard III and defeated the Yorkists. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. With this, the medieval period in England came to a close. We have walked together through 1,000 years of English history, from the quiet aftermath of Rome to the bloody end of the Plantagenets. We saw how kingdoms are built and unmade, how faith and conflict shaped the hopes and fears of ordinary people, and how institutions like parliaments and laws were born from hard-won struggles. Through wars and cathedrals, rebellions and revelations, I hope you have felt the humanity in it all, the hopes, fears, and dreams of those who lived long ago. Thank you for traveling with me into the past. As we part now, remember that history is a tapestry woven by countless souls, a tapestry to which you and I belong. Though the Middle Ages are long past, they shaped the very foundation of our world. The kings and buildings and even the words we use all carry whispers of their age. Now, as our journey ends, I wish you peace and inspiration. Good night, and may these stories fill your dreams with distant echoes of adventure and wonder.